Good evening, everyone. My name is Arthur Conquest. I'm the president of the Town Meeting Members Association and am a town meeting member from Precinct 6. I want to welcome the various presenters participating in this League of Women Voters Brookline Neighborhood Alliance forum this evening, and those who are in our viewing audience via Zoom broadcast. I want to start off by introducing the two other officers from the Town Meeting Members Association who will be participating in the forum. Harry K. Freeman is the organization's corresponding secretary, and Ernest Fry is our recording secretary. Mr. George Abbott White, our vice president, and Ms. Susan Cohen, the organization's treasurer, are not present, though I do want to recognize them. None of this would occur, none of this would be possible without the assistance and technical expertise of Ms. Betsy DeWitt, president of the League of Women Voters, and all the other individuals from the League who have made this event possible this evening. Betsy, I'd like to turn the stage over to you.
Thank you very much, Arthur. And I appreciate the cooperation that we have from the Town Meeting Members Association, the Brookline Neighborhood Alliance, and welcome all of our guests to this forum. This is the second warrant article forum, and it's intended to explain, not have a debate. Unfortunately, a limited number of the more than 40 warrant articles scheduled for votes at the town meeting beginning next Tuesday. We understand and apologize. We know there was some confusion about questions at our Monday forum, and we admit we didn't properly understand the Zoom Q&A as well as we probably should have. But the way we will be doing it tonight is what we tried to do on Monday, and that is put your questions in the Q&A, which is in the bottom strip of your Zoom screen, and our question coordinator will collect them. They may disappear from the Q&A, but don't panic about that. It's because the coordinator is gathering them up and then we'll put them in a different screen that I, as the moderator, can see so that I can ask the speakers the questions. So just want everybody to understand, we hope we have learned how to do a better job and we hope it will not cause confusion tonight. Anyway, for tonight, we have 4 sets of articles, and we will begin with Articles 19 and 20, proposing that the town clerk, who is currently elected, would become appointed, similar to other Brookline town department heads. The petitioner for this warrant article is the Brookline Select Board, and we have speakers, Harry Bors from the both advisory committee and the town, this Committee on Town Organization and Structure. And we also have Deputy Town Administrator Melissa Goff, who can, both of them will help us understand the background to these 2 articles. And in particular, Melissa will be able to explain the procedure that would be followed should the town clerk become appointed. So at this point, I would be very pleased to welcome Harry Bors speaking to explain Articles 19 and 20. And to be absolutely clear, I believe the Select Board and Advisory Committee have recommended favorable action on votes, but the votes have been proposed by the Committee on Town Organization and Structure. So, Mr. Bors, you have the floor.
Okay, I believe I am unmuted.
Good.
So I'll wear my CTOS hat. I'll speak for CTOS. I will say CTOS as well as the advisory committee are both recommending favorable action on this. So I will give you some of the background and the reasoning and tell you just sort of what it is. So as some of you may or may not know, There's not been a contested race for town clerk in Brookline for over 30 years. And we will never know whether this is because there were no other candidates with the required skills or experience or interest, or if it was a result of satisfaction with the position as it was filled. What we do know, however, is that a beloved member of our community, our longstanding town clerk, has fallen victim to a debilitating illness and in all likelihood will not be running for re-election in the spring. Now, traditionally, historically, the acting assistant town clerk has run for office when a town clerk has either retired or stepped down. Brookline's assistant town clerk has made it very clear to us that she has no intention at all of pursuing the position. So that puts us in a spot as a community, creating a certain level of urgency. Not to overemphasize it, but there is a certain urgency. Beyond that urgency with regards to transition, however, is also the larger issue of the long view. And so that's why we have warrant articles 19 and 20 before us. So let's be clear that the job of town clerk is not an entry-level position. It's a professional position, even if it is currently filled through public acclamation. It requires training, it requires experience, it requires knowledge, and it takes about 3 years to become a certified town clerk. And it's not just about running elections or issuing wedding licenses. The town clerk is also our town archivist, managing the registry of vital statistics, maintaining town documents and the town databases. The town clerk is the official keeper of the town seal, which means certifying zoning documents and plans, as well as tax rates. So it really is a position and an office that needs to be integrated into the workings of the town as a whole, not simply a standalone agency. And the town clerk should be recognized as a senior level professional department head, as we do with other department heads in this town. Now, we had hired Jeff Nutter to come in and support the town clerk's office and to help Linda Goldberg, our longstanding assistant town clerk. And he comes with a great breadth and depth of knowledge and experience. Likewise, Linda has deep experience and institutional knowledge in the town clerk's office here in Brookline. Both have strongly advised us that the town clerk position should be an appointed position. The job and responsibilities have changed enormously in the past 30 years. And keep in mind, the town treasurer was once elected, and that position now resides in the finance department, as it should, because times change. So what Brookline needs is someone who is qualified and experienced to be a town clerk. We believe the best way to ensure that we have the best candidates from the broadest selection pool, and to be better structured as an organization for transition planning, is to have an appointed town clerk. Now, concerns have been voiced that an appointed town clerk could be under the thumb of the town administrator or the select board or be strong-armed. But let's not kid ourselves. Town hall is not Tammany Hall. And there have been stories of elected town clerks in other municipalities hiring cronies and installing registrars to enroll the right sorts of voters. So conspiracy theories can cut both ways. In fact, the appointment process in Brookline has worked pretty well for us. So what specifically will these articles, or this article primarily, do? It will allow for the appointment of a town clerk who does not have to be a resident of the town, by the way. The appointment is by the select board, as it is with other department heads. Is it possible there's somebody in Brookline with town clerk training and experience who's willing to run? Sure, but is it likely? And even if you found somebody with the requisite experience, do you think they're going to be living in Brookline? They may. It may be a stretch, perhaps not. But opening the potential pool of applicants, as we do with our other positions, serves Brookline well. So reviewing the legislation and consulting with town council, we are confident that an appointed town clerk is not required to be a town resident, but the language of the article would in fact underscore that understanding. And this does not require home rule legislation. I should also point out that when we were reviewing this, a couple of other things came to light. So we may need to make changes in the Town Administrator Act in order to mesh with having an appointed position if we choose to do that. As well, we will need to change the bylaw that currently allows the town clerk to be an ex officio member of town meeting, and also clean up some archaic language around Board of Selectmen versus Select Board, Treasurer, Collector. None of these things, though, need to be done now, and it should not prohibit us from moving forward with this. So if approved by town meeting, this will go to the voters. It'll be on the ballot in the spring. If it's passed, the select board will likely need to appoint an interim town clerk while it does a formal search for a permanent appointment. It may fail, in which case we may have no town clerk, or somebody may come forward to jump in, although the level of experience will be unknown. But given that the current term is expiring, that the town clerk is not expected to seek re-election, and the assistant town clerk will not run, this is the time to make the change if we're going to do it. And we believe it's important for and advantageous to the town. So this is the time, in our estimate, the right time to make the change. So thank you.
Can I just ask you a question before Melissa speaks? I understand that the way we would go forward has to take into account that the position is going to be on the ballot at the spring town election, right? That is an automatic, it's not negotiable, I guess is my comment.
Correct, because it is currently an elected position. The current term is expiring and the new term would begin this spring. So as of now, it's an elected position going into that election. So it will show up on the ballot. So we'll make it sort of a weird do-si-do, so to speak, but that is another reason for doing it now. The timing matters. Otherwise, well, you don't know. I mean, somebody may jump in that we have no idea. That's great, although I would be surprised. But if otherwise you would have somebody and you would have to wait another 3 years until you could address this again. So we think the timing is pretty critical, that this would really be the time to look at it. But yes, there will still be essentially a position to be voted on in the spring.
Okay, so just to be absolutely clear, if there is a candidate who runs for town clerk in May 2021 and wins, that person has office for 3 years or would negotiate some form of departure?
They could, or they could have a term for 3 years.
Right.
It's really going to depend on what the voters do.
Okay, I just think this is an important thing for everybody to properly understand. Melissa, would you please tell us what is the normal procedure for hiring a department head? And given that we haven't been hiring town clerks lately, would you be doing, or, you know, in your capacity, would there be any investigation into the qualifications necessary to hire a town clerk?
Sure. So thank you, Melissa Goff, Deputy
Oh,
Town
I'm sorry,
Administrator.
he is the Assistant Town Administrator.
Deputy
Sorry,
Town
Melissa.
Administrator, thank you. So the typical process for hiring a department head, obviously before we start to recruit for the position, we likely would examine the job description. If the job description needed to be updated, that would go through the HR board for, you know, either grading or job description updates. Once that was ready for posting, then the town administrator would likely convene a panel. We typically have a panel of various members of the community. Typically it would be, you know, someone that is either familiar with the department, interacts with the department. If there was a board and commission that was interested, we would likely have a member of a board and commission. If, for example, DPW, Park and Rec Commission participated in that recruitment. Sometimes we'd have an outside expert. So in the case of, you know, a police chief or fire chief, it's not uncommon for us to pull in somebody from a surrounding community that's familiar with how that position works. A member of the select board would also represent the board on the panel as well. Sometimes we would have someone from the advisory committee. And this group would essentially go through the resumes, do the initial interviews of candidates, and then recommend to the town administrator about 2 or 3 candidates for finalists. And then the town administrator would do further rounds of interviews with the HR director, and then ultimately make a recommendation to the select board. So I think there was a second part of your question as well, Betsy. Can you, I think I addressed it with the HR board reviewing the job description.
Right. Given that we know the possibility exists that there could be a candidate who could be elected in May, would this in your view, have any impact on the ability to recruit a qualified person? And one of my questions was, given that there's not, well, we know that there are more elected town clerks right now than there are appointed. So the pool of candidates might be, how should I put it, thin and require more outreach?
Well, there potentially, I think Jeff Nunning, when we talked about this, he suspected that there were probably a number of highly qualified number twos that might be interested in rising to the level of the town clerk position. So, you know, we might actually get a pretty substantial pool.
Okay,
Betsy, can I just ask a question? Arthur
sure, please
Conquest?
do, please do.
So does the town clerk have to live in Brookline? And how would you go about advertising if it were an elected position? Does that make sense to you?
So if the position is an elected position, the town clerk is required to be a Brookline resident. If the position is an appointed position, the town clerk is not required to be a town resident.
Okay, thank you.
So actually someone has asked, what would happen if there was a no, well, I don't know, maybe you could have two candidates, somebody who declared to be a candidate for town clerk and then a write-in candidate. How would that affect things?
In terms of the outcome, I think it all depends on what happens at the ballot. So
Right,
if the voters decide that they want to convert the position, regardless of whether or not there are multiple candidates, the outcome would still be the same.
and if there was no, let's say if no one came forward to be a candidate and what we got was a write-in candidate that only would be identified at the time of the ballots being counted, would that make a difference?
That's interesting. I suppose if the voters did not vote to support having it an appointed position and instead voted for whoever the write-in candidate was, you would have them for 3 years.
Okay, interesting. Not necessarily clearly what will occur, but a possibility, I suppose.
I
Okay.
suppose I was going to say there may be a chance that there's somebody who understands that dynamic and is willing to put their name on the ballot with the understanding that they are just there for a very short period of time until the formal search is done. So that's
Right.
another thought.
Well, it's an interesting situation that I don't think we have experienced about. We have no experience about this. Okay, I'm looking to see if we have any questions coming from our audience. And the answer is,
The answer
given
is
that
there's one more.
yep, I got it. I've got it. Given that the town has the ability to appoint a temporary town clerk due to the vacancy, and if an appointed clerk would be superior to any candidates coming up for election, I'm sorry, I hope you can hear me. Given that the town clerk has the town administrator theoretically has had the ability to appoint a temporary town clerk since March because of the vacancy. And if an appointed clerk would be superior to a candidate up for election, why haven't we started the job search to appoint a temporary town clerk in this gap period? Anybody want to tackle that one?
I think, you know, when under the circumstances of the shutdown in March, I think we were very fortunate to have Jeff Nunning available to support the town. And we also, Jeff didn't have experience as a town clerk, but he has a lot of experience in municipal management. So he has been working very well with Linda. And I think that, you know, going forward, I think the temporary appointment is something that once we have a better understanding of, you know, the current situation of the incumbent, we may want to reconsider our options there. But at this point, we felt like Jeff was doing a really great job. So to keep things in place until we had a better understanding of how things were going to change.
And I think we have a sort of follow-up question. Since Mr. Nutting is filling in, does he have the appointed title, temporary town clerk?
I believe that was that Pat designated Linda as the temporary town clerk.
Oh, all right, so Linda Goldberg is the current temporary town clerk, and she's being assisted by Jeff Goldberg. So
Jeff
we have
Nutting.
Jeff, Linda Goldberg and Jeff Nutting, I apologize. All right, so we have, in fact, a temporary town clerk in the experienced assistant town clerk and her colleague, Jeff Nutting, who is supporting her in the office for the work that has to be accomplished. Okay, looking to see if there are any more questions. And seeing none, wait a minute, nope, okay, that's all on this warrant article. So do you either have anything you would like to add to what's been said about these two items, the two warrant articles that will be coming up for a vote at town meeting sometime maybe next week, right? Okay.
If I just could add one thing, that I know that the town administrator is very interested in having this position expand their functions around community engagement, and that we feel like there's a lot of work that could be done to enhance the office. So we feel that that would be a benefit to the town as well.
And what you're saying is the town clerk might also become one of the department, or the town clerk's office department would become involved in this community engagement.
If you look at other communities in the Commonwealth, a lot of times when you see the appointed town clerks, there's definitely a more robust community engagement strategy there.
Well, that's good to hear. Okay, then we will move on. The next, again, is a pair of warrant articles that are different but associated. They're Articles 32 and 33. Both are resolutions, and they propose reallocating town budget priorities in order to address disparities and underfunded needs in vulnerable populations. There are a group of 9 petitioners. 7 of the 9 are town meeting members. And our speakers tonight will be on beginning with Article 32, will be Bonnie Bastian, and she's a town meeting member from Precinct 5. Article 32 proposes a study group to report on actions to address funding disparities and underfunded needs. And following Bonnie on Article 33 will be Cliff Brown, and he'll discuss Article 33, which focuses on the overall allocation of funding between the town departments and the schools departments. Mike Sandman may comment on both. And Cliff Brown and Mike Sandman are town meeting members and members of the advisory committee, just for a little background. Also, FYI, the select board and advisory committee have recommended favorable action on amended versions of each of these proposed resolutions. So Bonnie, step forward and make all of this clear if you could, please.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yep, fine,
Great.
welcome.
Thank you. My name is Bonnie Bastian. I'm a town meeting member in Precinct 5 and a general organizer for Mutual Aid Brookline. Thank you so much for having me tonight. The Budget Equity Resolution, also known as Warrant Article 2, revisits the inequities in Brookline that Deborah Brown, Scott Ananian, and I were trying to mitigate back in June with our police budget amendments. We aimed to reallocate money from the police department to essential social services in Brookline. That budget amendment failed, but many town meeting members agreed that the inequities we presented as reasons to amend the budget were indeed problems that needed to be addressed. Here we are many months later into the pandemic, and we have no sustainable ways to come to our community's aid. Now that we are in November and COVID cases are ticking up again and remote learning seems to be a long-term reality, we have failed our communities in public and low-income housing whose children are struggling with insufficient Wi-Fi access and inadequate housing. We are failing our low-income families and elderly communities who suffer from food insecurity and an overwhelming amount of growing debt and more. These are the problems Mutual Aid Brookline, the food pantry, the Safety Net Fund, and other groups in town are fighting to mitigate every day. And we struggle. We are overwhelmed. None of us have the reliable funding or the flexibility to be more than a very insufficient Band-Aid. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of numbers here. My computer is slowing up. In the Globe on this past Saturday, there was an article that stated that Norfolk County has the largest increase, in food insecurity in the entire country at 163%. That's the largest increase. So not the largest food insecurity, but that's an enormous, enormous increase. Also in Norfolk County, about 43,400 people were considered food insecure before the pandemic. In a 2018 Brookline survey, 26% of seniors reported having no food for a whole day, 1 to 10 days in the previous month. An additional 18% went to bed hungry at least once in the previous month. Since COVID-19, the food pantry is now serving over 800 families each week, and they return twice as often as in pre-COVID times. So this is more than 4 times pre-COVID levels. In addition to this, Mutual Aid Brookline still has to catch people falling through the cracks with food and supply deliveries, childcare subsidies, and a lot more. We subsidize an average of $1,300 worth of groceries and supplies each week, which is about $5,200 a month. These past weeks, 92% of deliveries are repeat clients, which indicates that our community is very much relying on us for resources. So what we're trying to do with Warrant Article 32 is to build a more sustainable way to mend these tears in our community. To bake these priorities into the annual budget. And I understand that it isn't always as easy as moving money from our town budget to the BHA or another entity like the food pantry. The laws make this more complicated, but we need to get creative. We need to find new and innovative ways to solve these issues because we are in very, very unprecedented times. So it's going to call on the best of our creativity to figure this out. There has always been reason to do this work, to recenter our budget priorities squarely in equity. But now in the economic destruction of the pandemic, there is no excuse. These shifts in budget priorities have the potential to be pivotal in making sure all communities in Brookline thrive. So I'm going to very briefly give the history of the evolution of Warrant Article 32. It began as a resolution asking the town to prioritize addressing the growing disparities, as I just listed, in the budget process for the town. And through the hearing process, the largest change came through the select board when Chair Green fully revised the warrant article to instead require the creation of a report written by the Chief Diversity Officer in the OCICR, the Office of I'm going to forget what that all stands for, I'm blanking out. He would be directed to confer with all of the institutions and non-town entities that are working on the front lines of COVID emergency, like the Brookline Food Pantry, the Brookline Center, and the Brookline Community Foundation, and more. The petitioners finally revised that version to include a working group centered in the CDICR, the Commission of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations. I think I just messed up those letters up there. Anyway, in addition to the Chief Diversity Officer The working group would include the chief diversity officer so that there would be more voices included that are not town staff, that are familiar with these inequities and crises in town, as well as the many organizations working to address them. We agreed to the AC's amendment to include 3 reports, one initial report due by the opening of the warrant for town meeting in the spring, an interim report due March 31st, and a final report due by September 2021. In this report, we'll include research compiled with the help of the organizations already doing this work in town, which includes real numbers of what is needed to make a real impact, recommended allocations in the 2022 town budget to intentionally target these disparities, and a list of concrete actions that can be taken by the town and more. And that is all I have for you. Please let me know what questions you might have, or if Scott has anything to add to that.
Well, we can also see if Mr. Sandman would like to make any comments about this particular warrant article, since he's
Yeah.
on cue for both of them.
Do you want me to wait until the two are really in many ways together? And so I'd rather wait.
If you'd like to hold your comments until you've heard both sides, that's fine. I'm just offering the option right now if you'd like.
I'd like to wait. Thank you.
Okay, fine. Then, well, we will then move on to the second warrant article, which is Article 33, and the one that has been focused on the way the town's funds are allocated between the schools and the town separately. And I happen to know that there are some constraints on how much flexibility the town has with regard to the school's budget, since the school committee is independent. But Mr. Brown, take over and explain. You have to unmute yourself first, however.
Fair enough. Thank you, Betsy. Good evening. My name is Cliff Brown. I'm a town meeting member from Precinct 14 and a member of the advisory committee, or chair of the school subcommittee, which is the subcommittee of the advisory committee that reviewed Article 33 during the warrant review process. As Bonnie alluded, both 32 and 33 are articles that grew out of frustration with the budget and resource allocation process that was experienced last spring, particularly by the authors of the police budget amendment proposal, but other individuals as well. This Article 33 was sponsored by, or is sponsored by, Deborah Brown, Arthur Conquest, and David Lescoyer. And in considering what they felt where they felt they should go to look for places to propose changes that might result in a more inclusive and more transparent budget process, they identified the town school partnership as the most viable mechanism. To buttress their arguments for changing the town school partnership and the balance of their original reserve clauses, they referenced several parts of the report submitted last winter by the Brookline Fiscal Advisory Committee, of which I was a member. Now, the thrust of the petitioner's original article was really kind of had three legs on the stool. The first was to change the composition and scope of the town school partnership. The second was to utilize free cash in a manner that would prioritize specific programs and investments. And the third would be to promote the concept of participatory budgeting in Brookline. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the town school partnership because it's really kind of a rabbit hole if we go down it, but it is something that was formed back in 1995 by an agreement between the towns and the school, and works to allocate marginal increases or decreases in revenue year over year. So it's not something that deals with total revenue. It's something that deals with marginal revenue year over year. Conversations with the petitioners identified several misconceptions about the town school partnership, the way it worked, and in addition, misconceptions about the town's free cash policies, what free cash could be used for, and the references to BFAC recommendations were felt to not necessarily be on point with what it was that the petitioners were saying they wanted to accomplish. As a result of conversations between the subcommittee or some members of the subcommittee and the petitioners, the article was refined and restructured and became something that really tried to work with what it was that the petitioners said they wanted to accomplish in a manner that we felt that it might have a better chance of succeeding at the town meeting. So now the article has been reframed so that the principal objectives, again, overlap quite substantially with what the original ones were, but refined. So the first is the adoption of changes to the town school partnership that were recommended by the Brookline Fiscal Advisory Committee last winter. There are 8 particular points. They are included in the combined reports if people want to read them. A re-examination of the free cash waterfall so that perhaps it could be redefined in a way that could potentially help vulnerable populations in emergency circumstances like we currently are experiencing here in Brookline, which the free cash waterfall really does not seem to have the flexibility to do that today. And the third is the carryover, to a certain extent, the evaluation of a formal participatory budgeting process in Brookline, not necessarily the implementation of one, but the evaluation of one to see whether or not it makes sense and how it would actually be put in place. The select board took the advisory committee's revised article, advisory committee, and I should say the petitioner's revised article, and further refined it primarily by modifying or eliminating several of the whereas clauses. However, the resolve clauses were essentially unchanged with reference to the work of the Fiscal Policy Review Committee being the principal modification. Both the advisory committee and the select board have voted overwhelmingly to approve or recommend favorable action on the petitioner's revised article as amended by the select board. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Sandman, are you ready to now add your commentary?
As I say, I think these two things go together. And 32, really both of them are a cri de coeur. They're a cry from the heart. And the problems that Barney outlined are real. And they've always been there. The Community Foundation issued a really interesting report several years ago on Brookline, needs in Brookline. And Brookline is drifting towards having a distribution of income that is bimodal, a substantial number of people with substantial incomes and a number of people with low incomes and not much in the middle. And it's the low income side of it that we really have to recognize and address. At the same time, the town is under pressure from the effects of COVID-19. We have a drop in local receipts from hotel and meals taxes and from parking meter receipts. And there's a likelihood that we'll see a cut in state aid in fiscal 22, which begins in July of next year. So finding money for new expenses isn't going to be easy, but it's a moral imperative. And the advisory committee wants very much to work with the town administrator to find at least some dollars to put towards these things. And so I think the two warrant articles on their own are an expression of desire, an expression of direction that the petitioners want town meeting to go in and want the town to go in. Putting the practical, putting this into practice and actually doing something in reality is going to take some work. And on the one hand, on the other hand, it's no excuse to shy away from it. It's something that needs to be done. And speaking from the advisory committee's perspective, we were very interested in both articles as they were amended. And we're going to make sure that there is a strong effort to find the money to do some of this, not all of it, but certainly some of it.
So I have a little follow-up since we don't seem to have a great many audience questions. And I guess I'm going to first say, I do understand that the town gave a portion of its, I think, CDC, which is a
Block development grant, right?
yeah, right, to the Brookline Community Foundation for its emergency assistance program early on, sometime back in the fall, I think. Isn't that correct?
Yeah.
So there have been acknowledgements of this particular, I'm going to say, extraordinary set of conditions that we find ourselves in. But it also perhaps creates an example of other ways that those kinds of funds could be allocated compared to their normal, let's say, allocations.
The community block development grant funds are a very, we have a great deal of flexibility with that money. And I know there are some people who would say, well, we should be taking money out of the budget that we fund through tax dollars, but a dollar is a dollar. It doesn't really matter where it comes from. And if we can if we can use some of the community development block grant funds for these purposes, it will have an effect. Instead of putting more flowers, more and shrubs on the traffic circles and on in public view, we could use these funds for food aid. We may be able to use them for some other aspect of what the needs that have been identified here. And I think it's a mistake to say, well, the community development block grant funds, that's not real. We're really not spending the taxpayers' money on this. We are spending the taxpayers' money on it. I think we can use both the funding and the mechanism of working through the community foundation to find a pathway that works.
Okay. And I believe Ms. Bastian, you would like to respond. So you must unmute yourself, please.
Yes, we have definitely seen the community block grants in the fall or whenever they were allocated. And those are meaningful amounts of money. But what's crazy is that it's nowhere near enough.
Yep.
And also that money is gone right now. So we aren't able to predict when that money comes or how much it'll be or things like that, if I understand things correctly. And I think Warrant Article 32 is a push to really center the priorities and the values that we have all stated are our values and reflect, center them in our budget so that we can take some town money and be able to do something with it, to have more flexibility and long-term abilities to address these problems, because we don't have a way to address emergencies like this. And I just got a note that the community block grant was in May. That was quite a long time ago.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Liz, for that note. So yeah, I want to make sure we do definitely acknowledge the federal money. That's very important, and we hope that keeps coming. But this is unprecedented times, so we need unprecedented solutions. And so we're asking for this big shift in our creativity in how we can solve these problems. So I hope that we can gather some inspiration and really think hard about avenues that we haven't tried yet.
Yes, and I just would like to make it clear, I understood that the CDC money was a short-term response to a particular, let's call it reasonably crisis situation. And it's the warrant articles are addressing a much more long-term approach to how these decisions are made and how the allocations are made. I understand that. So Cliff, do you have something you would like to add?
No, not particularly. I think that you actually hit on it with your last comment that certainly Warrant Article 33 tries to create a framework and put in place, if these steps are carried through, policies and approaches that would provide the town with more flexibility, the ability to be more nimble, if you will, with budget and resource allocations in situations like this, which really are extraordinary and which have kind of flummoxed us a little bit.
Right. Okay, well, thank you all for your helpful discussion. And we will now move on to Warrant Article 34, which again, I believe is addressing some similar issues, but from a different perspective. This is a resolution recommending planning to increase housing production. There are a group of 11 petitioners, 7 are town meeting members. The speakers will be primary petitioner Jeff Wachter, who will explain the petitioner's proposal to increase Brookline housing units and affordability, and comments from David Pollock, a member of the advisory committee, a trained architect, and he will discuss the advisory committee's amended proposal. So I understand that we have some slides to share with Jeff. Is that correct, Mr. Wachter?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay,
and
so
thank you.
are you doing that or are we doing that?
I'm going to be doing that.
Okay, fine. Then whatever you need to do, set up your screen sharing.
All right, so hopefully everyone can see the first slide there.
Yep, looks good.
You're not in present mode though?
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Great.
Thanks.
Hi, so Warrant Article 34 is a resolution to increase housing affordability and address Brookline's housing shortage. The idea of the resolution is to call on our town to develop the strategies to allow an increase in housing supply in Brookline, with a particular focus on combating housing affordability and climate change, increasing racial equity and diversity, and bolstering our local economy. So what does the resolution call for? We call on a robust housing production plan already in the works from the Housing Advisory Board and Planning Department to encourage new housing units to be built and to set a numerical housing production target for the town. We can't have the housing production plan simply be another report in a long line of reports sitting on a shelf gathering dust. So therefore we call on the select board and other boards and commissions to propose zoning and regulatory reforms necessary. We particularly call for the consideration of strategies to overcome historic racial and ethnic exclusion baked into the current zoning code and to support Brookline's zero emissions goal by using zoning changes to maximize public transit usage and or minimize car trips. To raise, we also hope to raise the issue of local housing production goals and targets with all potential appointees to relevant boards, again, in an effort to ensure that these plans don't simply sit on the shelf gathering dust. And finally, to consider budgetary action to fund the studies and necessary follow-up. At the moment, that budgetary action is not necessary. The housing production plan is already being funded, but we hope that the proposals that may arise from it might need some additional staff resources for the planning department. So why is Brookline's housing shortage a problem? The strong regional economy has led to increased high-paying jobs and a growing population, which leads to higher housing demand for relatively stagnant regional supply. Here in Brookline, the increasing demand has led to significant cost burden for town residents. 47% of renters spend more than 30% of their income on rent, and 23% spend more than half. New multifamily housing has been shown to have a significant impact on average rent in a number of studies in peer communities. So will building more housing actually help? You don't have to take my word for it. I've included here, as well as in the combined reports, a plethora of academic studies that show, yes, building more housing will help. Just to highlight a couple of them, the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank and the Upjohn Institute found that new buildings slow local rent increases. Economists at Freddie Mac have concluded that policymakers should adopt policies that would increase the elasticity of supply, driving down prices. And as you can see, we have studies from a wide range of academic and think tank institutions supporting this. So how does racial equity and diversity fit into this discussion? By now, many of you have at least heard how the history of redlining barred racial minorities from living in many neighborhoods, including here in Brookline. What is probably less well known is that in some of the earliest zoning regulations, including in Brookline 100 years ago, we explicitly established the code was explicitly established to separate the races. The legacy of these policy choices reverberates across our town today. The maps you see here show the original redlining maps for Brookline, with green representing what was judged best and yellow and red sections declining and hazardous. Superimposed on the map on the left shows where single-family only zoning exists in Brookline today, and the right map shows where multifamily housing is allowed. The continued influence of the redlining maps is stark. None of the best areas and very few parcels in the second tier allow multifamily housing. The way our town looks today is inextricably linked to the racist redlining maps of the 1930s. The impact this has had on racial diversity continues today, as studies have shown that anti-density zoning increases Black residential segregation in US metropolitan areas by reducing the quantity of affordable housing in white jurisdictions. From a climate change perspective, adding housing in Brookline would have a positive impact on decreasing carbon emissions for the region. Brookline's capacity to increase our housing stock near trains and buses helps preserve open space for the entire region. Average household carbon footprint is significantly lower in denser neighborhoods. And apartments in buildings with 5 or more units use about 40% as much energy as single-family detached homes. And as we can see from the map here, which shows the annual per capita carbon footprint by zip code in the Boston region, allowing more people to live in Brookline versus our neighboring communities further from the Boston and Cambridge job corps would allow individuals to live greener lives. And finally, why is this resolution worth passing? We need to recognize that housing production is an important goal and develop actionable strategies to achieve it. We can either continue on our trajectory toward becoming a community of the super rich and subsidized low-income residents, as Mr. Salmon alluded to earlier, or we can make the changes necessary to have a vibrant, diverse, and welcoming Brookline that we want. Increased housing production through zoning changes has been a policy goal of President-elect Joe Biden, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Governor Baker, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, and economists and academics from across the political spectrum. Brookline can continue to be a regional leader like we've been on so many issues. We know our housing shortage will require changes in many jurisdictions. Brookline can lead the way with creative, meaningful change. Brookline has a moral and ethical responsibility and the capacity to contribute its share toward the vital goal of housing development. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Pollack, would you like to respond, comment on the suggestions that have been made?
Well, I'm happy to talk about the Warrant article and talk about the advisory committee's alternate motion. I'm David Pollack, town meeting member from precinct 11 and relatively new member of the advisory committee. And tonight I'm wearing my advisory committee hat. I sit on the advisory committee's planning and regulation subcommittee, and excuse me, the planning and regulation subcommittee brought this warrant article forward to advisory. Warrant Article 34 seeks to address housing unaffordability in Brookline through a resolution that urges town government to prioritize housing growth as a development objective and to increase the overall supply of housing units in Brookline. The advisory committee had robust discussions of Warrant Article 34 at both the Planning and Regulation Subcommittee and at the full advisory, with much appreciated participation by Jeff and the other petitioners. Advisory then voted a recommendation of no action by a vote of 0 to 26 with no abstentions on the original motion, and voted to recommend favorable action on a substitute motion by a vote of 14 to 2 with 10 abstentions. The petitioners have subsequently revised their version, and that revision was included in the combined reports, but it has not come back to the advisory committee. So as things stand, town meeting will be presented with a choice between the petitioner's revised motion, the advisory committee motion, and of course, no action. The advisory committee was broadly supportive of Warrant Article 34's overarching goal of increasing housing affordability in Brookline. However, there was little support for the goal of just increasing housing based on the arguments that were presented in the warrant article. This distinction is the essential difference between the two versions of Warrant Article 34. The petitioner's motion asks for a resolution to add housing units and to study how and where to build them. The advisory motion asks for a resolution to study the costs and benefits of housing growth under different scenarios and to use that information to determine whether to encourage housing growth, how much housing to add, how to accomplish it, and where to add it. Advisory articulated several concerns, particularly about Warrant Article 34 as originally presented. First among these was the numeric goal of adding 3,300 new housing units, a goal which the petitioners have deleted from their more recent draft. Simply put, advisory felt that a numerical goal was premature, that the math behind the number presented was questionable, and that the beneficial impact on housing affordability was implied but not specified nor quantified. Advisory just didn't buy the argument that more housing is the best way to create more affordability. And conversely, a lot of concerns were articulated about possible unanticipated negative consequences. Advisory committee members expressed skepticism about several of the core arguments made by the petitioners. The argument that additional housing units in Brookline would result in reduced housing prices was unconvincing because Brookline is a small piece of a large regional housing market. The argument that new housing growth will make existing aging housing stock more affordable was questioned because it assumes that the new buildings won't require tearing down and replacing the very buildings that are supposed to be getting more affordable. And the argument that Brookline hasn't been doing its part because its housing growth has been slower than that of neighboring communities ignores Brookline's relative lack of developable land. Many nearby communities have redevelopable former industrial areas and/or farm and woodland opportunity sites that just don't exist in Brookline. The advisory committee's alternative motion urges a robust planning process that would allow for, but doesn't insist that the outcome of the study will be a recommendation of zoning changes to enable housing growth. Instead, advisory urges the town to engage in the same vigorous process that the petitioners urge, building off of the 2016 housing production plan, but with a more holistic focus. The advisory motion asks that zoning changes be studied to understand all of their impacts, as well as all of their benefits to the town. It lists several impact areas to be studied, including public works, open space, education, and historic streetscape. Another key difference between the versions is that the advisory motion deletes what it called a litmus test in the original motion that would have required candidates to appointed boards and commissions to, quote, affirmatively agree to a housing agenda. There was universal objection to this requirement, and while it has been considerably softened in the petitioner's revised motion, it is still included there. The advisory motion also urges the select board to consider providing the necessary budget allocation to execute the studies recommended by the resolution. This is a key provision that will keep the work moving forward. We who are fortunate enough to live here are pretty much unanimous in agreeing that Brookline is a wonderful place. We're not alone in that assessment. The ranking and review website Niche named Brookline the quote, 2020 best place to live in Massachusetts, and in the top 10 nationwide. We have a pressing need to broaden the opportunity, particularly for low and middle income residents, to be able to be part of our community. This need is in tension with our desire to maintain the qualities of our town that make it so wonderful. And the tension becomes very real when we engage in the detailed planning conversation about exactly where and how much we should grow. The 2016 Housing Production Plan identifies specific geographic, quote, opportunity nodes for potential new housing units and provides target unit counts for these areas. It's notable that in the two areas of greatest intensity, Coolidge Corner and Hancock Village, the targeted growth has already been met or exceeded with new construction projects that are permitted or recently completed. The reality is that our current long-range plans have not yet identified even a small fraction of the specific sites that would accommodate the magnitude of new housing contemplated by the petitioners. We need an open and inclusive process that engages a broad spectrum of stakeholders in order to successfully address the compelling challenges of housing affordability in Brookline. Warrant Article 34 moves us forward in this work, and the advisory committee's version, in not assuming the outcome before engaging in the study, allows for deeper engagement with our community's vision and values.
Thank you. I'm gonna just throw out a question which either one of you can answer, but my understanding is that we will be increasing affordable housing with the development of the Newbury College property. Is that not correct?
As part of the inclusionary zoning bylaw related to the, you're talking about the senior housing development on.
Right.
Yeah. So as part of that, there was a significant contribution to the Housing Trust Fund, which is being utilized to add, I believe, 40 additional units to a current Brookline Housing Authority property.
Right. And I'm just going to make a general observation that was triggered in my mind by the map you were showing. And it has to do with the fact that a big chunk of Brookline consists of Lars Anderson Park, the Allendale Farm, and which is private, but nonetheless, it's a farm in Brookline. Not very many communities of our size and density can have a farm. And it includes a very large chunk of private land owned by the country club. None of that seems to me is potentially developable space, which then forces the concentration into a relatively, how should I put it, smaller percentage of the whole of the town. And I'm curious if anybody gave any thought to that particular issue.
Certainly, that a big chunk of that down there is exactly like you said. There's parks there. There's significant chunks of parkland in the yellow and blue areas as well. I think there's still a significant part of the property in the green area that is currently single family only. Is still possible to add significant density by allowing smaller housing lot sizes, by allowing duplexes and triplexes that are currently banned. So there's significant opportunity for housing growth, even if we are hoping to not develop Allendale Farm or the golf course, et cetera.
Okay, we do have,
Betsy.
sorry, go ahead. Speak up.
Yeah, I'm a little confused. When you said additional pieces of land from the country club, did you mean the golf course, or is there land beyond the golf course that is associated with the country club?
I was just simply saying that it's privately owned property. Okay? It's owned.
The golf course.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Well,
okay,
wait a minute.
gotcha.
We have sorry. There are two golf courses out there.
Right, but I'm talking about the country club.
We have a Brookline public golf course, which is adjacent to Allendale Farm and Lars Anderson Park, which are, I will say, public space, public open space. And then there's another big chunk of space that's owned by the country club. It's just, when you look at the map and you see that big area, it consists of several large, how should I put it, properties. At least several of them are public. One of them actually is a cemetery. And then another large chunk of land that is owned by the country club, all of which would have to be dramatically changed if it were to be developed.
I also want to point out that on the map itself, the area of Lars Anderson and the golf courses actually wasn't part of the green area. It was white because it wasn't zoned that way. So there is still a significant chunk of that land that is currently residential.
Right. I'm just pointing out that it's open space, period. That's all I'm saying. It's big open space. Having said that, we have one question. And I guess it goes probably to Jeff, but if you'd like to chime in, David Pollock, please do. How would increasing the housing density potentially affect the public school population and the town's ability to accommodate the additional students?
Sure. So I think that's certainly an open question. I think a lot of it has to do with the type of housing that gets built. There's significant need in town for senior-specific housing, as well as smaller units that would be targeted more towards young professionals as well. However, obviously, with a significant increase in housing, additional students would be welcome to live in this housing. However, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council in 2017 studied this exact question: does increasing housing have a significant impact on the student population? And from this report, their conclusion, I quote, "We find that the conventional wisdom that links housing production with inevitable enrollment growth no longer holds true. At the district level, we observe no meaningful correlation between housing production rates and enrollment growth over the period studied 2010 to 2016.
And did that study Brookline?
Yes, it did.
Okay. Mr. Pollock, do you have any comments?
Well, the school enrollment population and how it affects the school buildings and housing growth. Obviously, we've had a very robust conversation for the last decade or more as the school population exploded and under conditions where we weren't building large amounts of housing. So it's pretty clear that in Brookline they're not locked together in a correlation. But it's also, I can just say anecdotally, to me, if we have more family housing, we'll have more families and more public school enrollment because of the desirability to live in Brookline and to have children go to Brookline schools. But generally, what I wanted to say actually is that the Economic Development Advisory Board, EDAB, has been working very hard developing a new spreadsheet or tool to calculate the financial impact of development of all kinds on the town's cost structure. And that includes school enrollment and school children generated by different kinds of housing, and they're trying to create a model that fully loads the cost, including police and fire and other community services, so that we can really rationally, as we move forward studying this, look at what the costs and benefits are of different kind of development. So we don't have to, just sort of say we can't afford to have any more housing because it's going to overwhelm our schools. We can actually look at the costs and benefits and understand, will it have a net beneficial effect to residential tax rates for the existing homeowners, or will it provide an additional burden? And so stay tuned. That's EDAB's story, but that was a sneak preview.
Okay, since there's not another question, I guess I'm going to ask one of my own, and it has to do with historic preservation and the fact that this community has, in fact, designated a number of areas as historic districts. I think in order to preserve the architectural history that is embedded there. I'm pretty sure some people would take this as, how should I put it, have a different view on what a local historic district is. But I happen to know architectural historians who value them very highly. So I'm wondering if there's any thoughts that you have about how those neighborhoods would be affected in a process of increasing density. I mean, again, I think what I'm doing is, in my own mind, thinking about where it can happen, even if there is a change of regulations, it will still be in limited physical areas.
So let me take a crack at that with 3 quick comments. If we go back to the opportunities map when would assume in the 2021 housing production plan will be revised, but if we go back to the opportunities map of the 2016, it identifies about 10 different opportunity zones that at that time were places where more housing would be good places to build more housing. And it identifies opportunity corridors, which not surprisingly are Beacon Street, Boylston Street, and Harvard Street. And so those are still all kind of, a significant part of the conversation to come. And then Jeff just talked to us a little bit also about opportunities in lower density zones that can be talked about and that are part of the community conversation. In terms of historic streetscape, that was added to the advisory's version as something that needs to be considered. And in terms of local historic districts, which Brookline has 8 local historic districts, it's a fact that that the laws controlling development in local historic districts are immensely stronger than anything that's protected under the state or federal protections, which only give delays in demolition. But the actual our local historic districts are protected by state law that's quite robust. And so what could be done in those districts is already defined. And it's not like that could not be easily changed. I'm not sure how it could be changed.
So just sort of to wrap, Jeff, do you want to add anything?
No, I think David covered it quite nicely, actually.
Okay, and what I would argue is that the process going forward will then take into consideration the kinds of issues that have been raised by both of you tonight, with a goal of identifying through an updated housing production plan, how should I put it? The areas where density is can reasonably be added. Is that my fair summary of
Well,
what?
that's right. So that's definitely the goal of both versions. But what's different I think basically the core difference, there's some others in the whereases or whatever, but the basic difference is that the goal of adding housing is inherent in the petitioner's motion. That's assumed if you support that. And the advisory committee's motion says, let's find out. Let's identify and weigh the costs and benefits of adding housing across the town and in different ways, and then move on from what we learn to make recommendations. So it's a more deliberate approach that doesn't presuppose that we're going to add more housing. It just says, let's find out by doing a careful study.
Okay, and I now do have another question, which kind of fits into this theme. The question is the petitioner, and Jeff, this one's directed to you, recommending an increase in overall density in North Brookline? North Brookline is already nearly as dense as Somerville. Have they considered the T pre-pandemic was at capacity, not to mention the need for open space in North Brookline?
So to the first question, yes, I would expect that increasing housing in Brookline would add additional units in North Brookline. Hopefully, it would not only be in North Brookline. I think it's important that that the entire town adds additional housing in ways that are appropriate for those neighborhoods. With regard to public transit, yeah, I understand the challenges that the TS face, and I know that that's something that we would have to be looking at. I think a lot of there are various ways to increase transportation capacity without purely looking at the T. I was very heartened to see the protected bike lanes being added near St. Mary's. Hopefully getting hopefully that can extend all the way down Beacon so that more people can safely commute that way. As more people move here, but bike commuting is definitely one that is an area that's increasing. We also have significant two major bus routes that will service that primarily service the Longwood medical area, which is obviously one of the region's bigger job centers. So yeah, that we have to think about transportation as part of the housing production plan, as part of this planning process. Transportation certainly is a vital component of reasonable planning, and I think this article doesn't hope to avoid that planning process. I think that's we want to embrace that fully. But I also think that it's moving people is a problem that communities face and have faced, and we face here, and that it's our challenge to address that, and to find ways to continue to have a vibrant community while serving the needs of the region growing.
Okay, thank you. And I believe that's the last question. So we will move on. And I will say, to my astonishment, we are well ahead of our originally anticipated schedule. It's not a bad thing, but we will be moving on to warrant articles 36 and 37, which are resolutions proposing stipends for elected members of the select board and the school committee. The petitioner is Scott Ananian, a town meeting member. Advisory Committee Chair Mike Sandman will explain the advisory committee's position. And as I understand it, the select board has not so I know for sure select board has not taken a vote on 36 because they would be in conflict, because it is a matter in which the select board would have a financial interest. And they had a mixed vote on Article 37 with 2 yeses, 1 no, and 2 abstentions. The advisory committee recommends no action on Articles 36 and 37. And I will now turn over to Scott to speak to your warrant article.
Thank you very much. Let me, this slide share just went away. Hang on a second. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. So this is, was so, sorry, eloquently introduced. This is articles, resolutions proposing stipends for the select board and school committee. And I'm the lead petitioner on these articles this time round, but I do wish to acknowledge my debt to Neil Wyszynski, Mariah Nobrega, and Nicole McClelland, who brought similar articles last fall, and many others who've worked on it since then. So what's the big idea here? Serving on the select board and school committee is a lot of work. When I give this presentation to the school committee and select board, I don't need to elaborate on that, but they are putting in an enormous amount of work for our town. In the case of the school committee, completely uncompensated. And for the case of the select board, there's a very modest stipend. And the big idea here is that work without pay is simply inequitable and unprofessional. So Brookline has a proud tradition of volunteerism, and these articles are not seeking to overturn or abolish that. They're seeking to respect it. In fact, I personally, just to give a little bit of my biography, work for the Wikimedia Foundation, which works on the software behind Wikipedia. All our content is volunteer created. We have a large and thriving volunteer base. However, my position is paid. I couldn't devote the amount of time I do to the software that makes Wikipedia work if it weren't a paid position, because I have a family and needs, right? And the idea here is the same in town. We have a proud tradition of volunteerism in Brookline. We have town meeting members. We have innumerable boards and commissions. We have the League of Women Voters, for example, as well. We have the Town Meeting Members Association, and the Brookline Neighborhood Association, all sponsors of this event. However, we do have paid town staff. Once the demands of a position get to a certain point, continuing without pay ends up being inequitable because it excludes certain people from being able to participate in those positions. And that restricts the viewpoints that can be represented. And in some senses is also unprofessional, right? We seek to attract the best candidates for office, especially our highest offices, select board and school committee. But the private sector values the expertise that we would want in those positions much higher than the town does. And so we can't compete in that sense. And it's fiscally irresponsible. Our elected officials are entrusted with vital decisions, important oversight rules. And time and again, we see, especially matters of oversight being neglected simply because there are competing demands on our select board and our school committee's time. So when town business has to take a back seat to what actually pays the bills, you know, our select board and our school committee are doing a fantastic job, but I'm sure they would be the first to admit that they wish they would have more time to study some of the issues that come before them. So this is a relatively modest proposal. It's not a wholesale reinvention of town government, and it's not eliminating the need for elected officials to sacrifice their time and earnings to serve our town. It's not paying either of these positions what they would make on the open market, for example. For a job requiring over 20 hours a week, which is full half-time employment, these are not half-time salaries. And they're relatively, is 0.1% of the town and school budgets, respectively. So these are relative pittances, but they would increase the amount, the number of people who could, and the types of people who could consider serving on these boards and committees. So this is, as I mentioned, bringing back an article which was brought in fall of 2019. A few modest changes were made, mostly in direct response to comments which arose during debate at town meeting and in hearings before the school, before the advisory committee and select board. One was the stipend amount. The overall, the top line number was lowered, and this is more in line with the BFAC committee recommendations and the COVID-19 crisis. We'll also remove the gap between the chair and the other members. There was some concern that there would be a perverse incentive to run for chair because it was more highly paid. And right now, both the select board and school committee have a somewhat complicated relationship with co and vice chairs. And it seems like, in some sense, trying to navigate all the possible permutations there adds a lot of complexities. And further, people were concerned about maintaining the role of volunteerism in town. So to some degree, the role of chair is still a volunteer obligation that one member of these boards takes on for no additional pay. In response to concerns about pension impact and healthcare as well, the wording was changed to total cost of compensation, so that the numbers involved are the bottom line numbers to the town. Any healthcare costs or pension costs would be deducted from the take-home pay. The school committee was included this time. The earlier articles included only the select board. And this addressed some concerns about inequity that were raised in the 2019 debate. And the final concern that was raised in 2019 was proper timing. It was felt that the articles were brought at the wrong point in the budget cycle, and the BFAC recommended that the articles with budget implications would be brought in the spring. This was actually brought for a spring town meeting, but due to COVID, was one of the articles that was postponed till special town meeting. It's still the right time to allow the stipends to be included in the spring 2021 budget process, especially considering that the amounts involved are so low. So here's some comparative data just to sort of put the numbers in context. We had a select board member run for Norfolk County Commissioner recently, and in part because they needed additional income so they could devote more time to town government. The Norfolk County Commissioner pays slightly more than $40,000 a year for one meeting a week, which is only 30 minutes long. So it's 10 times the current select board stipend. And it would still be more than the select board members would make for less work if this warrant article passes. This warrant article, remember, is only $30,000 a year. And then if you look historically to select board compensation levels back to 1895, this is basically restoring the stipend to the level it was at up until 1948, roughly in effective dollars. What happened was in 1948, the stipend was more or less frozen, and it hasn't kept pace with inflation. And so inflation has eaten away at it and eaten away at it until it's a tenth of what it used to be. But the $30,000 proposed here is in line with historic levels for the select board. So this is not a new change. This is what we have been paying select board members at the turn of the century for 50 years. And it's in line with our neighboring cities and towns with comparable populations. So if you, most of our neighbors with comparable populations are cities. They have city council mayor structures. But if you sum up the total compensation for the executive board, the mayor and all the city council, or all of the select board members, $30,000 is in line with what is below the per capita cost that Cambridge and Quincy and Newton and Somerville and Malden are paying their executive committee. It's after the warrant article. If the warrant article were to pass, we'd be roughly in line with what Medford is paying its executive council. Although in that case, it's almost entirely in the mayor's salary. And then on the school committee side, if you look at our neighboring cities and towns for school committee, Cambridge, our closest perhaps neighbor, pays its school committee members $38,000 a year as stipend. Many of the cities have the mayor as the chair, so it's a little harder to do a complete overall school committee cost. Mayor salaries tend to be rather disproportionate. But this puts us in line roughly, sits below Cambridge, but at the same level Worcester is, slightly above Springfield. So there's a tension here between wanting to pay school committee members stipends comparable to the select board members, which are $30,000 a year, and acknowledging that our neighbors generally pay school committee less. I'm not sure I'm happy with that as a matter of equity, but this number is a compromise between those two sides. And I'm going to skip over this. There were some minor changes made from the amendment as they originally filed, but I already went over them. One was eliminating the difference between the chair and the members, and the reference to 20 hours a week was removed because town staff was worried it would have ACA implications. But that was a whereas clause. And then briefly, these are the sort of top 4 frequently asked questions about the article. I figured I'd cover them, and I'd be happy to answer these questions in more in depth. And there's a supplemental report coming around in your mailing that goes into more depth on all these. The first is the bottom line cost of the town after healthcare pensions is the easy math. It's $150,000 for the select board and $135,000 for the school committee because of the total cost of compensation language. There was a concern about whether the stipend should be instead dedicated to childcare or should it be need-based. The simple answer is that different folks have different needs. Some folks need childcare, some have some don't have children, but do have other obligations that would need to be compensated for. As mentioned, in some cases, it would allow some people to sort of take less work if they have flexible work. So cash helps meet people where they are. And the school committee does actually have the ability, because of the way that the town school partnership is structured, the town budgets the money for the schools, but the school committee has the discretion to spend it how they like. We had an interesting discussion at the school committee about this, and they discussed the idea of pooling the money and allocating it in a need-based way among school committee members. That's completely consistent with these warrant articles. They have the ability to do that if they decide to. Another question was, what about the COVID budget crunch? So this is setting the baseline budget target. For example, in this past fiscal year, we set a baseline budget, and then the baseline budget was cut by anywhere up to 11%. So, you know, these again are resolutions. They're seeking to set a baseline budget level. If the level in fiscal year 22 is less because of COVID needs, I think that's still consistent with the spirit of this resolution. And then finally, whether the stipend is enough to make a difference in terms of who runs. Well, it makes more of a difference the further down the socioeconomic level ladder you are, right? So it might not be enough to make a difference to someone well off, but a modest stipend to some may in fact be a determinative factor that allows them to run where they would not otherwise be able to run. And individual members are always free to decline the stipend if they feel that it doesn't make a difference to them, they don't need it. So I'm asking folks to vote favorable action at town meeting. In 2019, the Commission on Women and CDCR recommended favorable action with none opposed, and the stipend article very narrowly missed passage, 100 to 103. This year, the select board voted narrowly in favor of the school committee stipends, as Betsy described. They declined to vote on the select board stipends due to conflict of interest. The CDICR voted 11 to 0 in favor, and then 1 abstention in favor of the select board and school committee stipends. The Brookline Commission for Women voted in favor this time around, and the school committee had, as I said, a very insightful discussion, but declined to vote again due to perceived conflict of interest. So that's it. I'd be happy to take questions if folks have them.
Thank you. And now we will invite Mr. Sandman to speak.
Thank you. So the advisory committee recommends no action on warrant articles 36 and 37 by a vote of 20 to 4 with no abstentions. So a pretty substantial majority. And as Scott was speaking, I was thinking to myself, if only life was this simple, pay a stipend, get diversity. Unfortunately, it's not. The motion last year set a higher pay level, but there was also the question raised about, well, if you pay somebody and you're paying them ostensibly for a 20-hour plus work week, you have to provide medical insurance and a pension contribution, and taxes will be taken out, Social Security taxes and so forth will be taken out. And the response to that was to say, well, okay, we'll lower the number and we'll make it total compensation. And when you then consider the things that have to be paid out of that total compensation, the amount of money that people are actually going to take home from this stipend is actually really quite small. And we did not think that it was sufficient to, the comment that we make in the combined reports is, adding a relatively modest compensation would be marginal at best, and that we would not find diversity increase very much, if at all, as a consequence of this. Either you have to make up your minds to pay at a high enough level to really make a difference and attract people, or doing this felt like to us insufficient. And that was one theme. This is neither fish nor fowl. It's not enough to do the job. We weren't terribly enthusiastic about raising the amount. On the other hand, we do have a funding crunch, finding the additional funds to pay for a stipend. When you add it up, sure, it's a relatively small part of the total budget, but the total budget is under an enormous amount of pressure. And we heard about other demands for food aid, for housing and so forth, that really cry out for an answer, and to take money and spend it on this as opposed to, or instead of, or in addition to spending money on that becomes a very difficult proposition. Looking longer term, by increasing stipends and terming them compensation for half-time work, it brings into question the voluntary nature of the town's government structure. Are we a city? Let's have a mayor and a city council. Are we a town? We have a volunteer structure. So again, it's sort of neither here nor there. As a consequence, the advisory committee, as it did last time, recommends no action on both articles.
Thank you. We do have one question and I guess we're putting this to Scott. Are you suggesting that candidates for these elected positions would be prepared to give up a full-time job for a 3-year term with a stipend of $30,000?
What we have had current select board members say is they have flexible work. So if you're name a number of occupations, a lawyer, you can take less work. Folks go from 5 days a week down to 4 days a week and allocate the money that way. For some people, it would let them get help for household needs, right? So, if it could compensate for childcare, it could compensate for meals during the week when that otherwise you have to have your family eat out because for example, I cook for my family on many nights of the week. So that's the thing is money can meet people where they are at, right? If you have a flexible job and what you need is the ability to go down to fewer days a week or fewer hours or fewer cases or fewer whatever, then it lets you do that. Maybe you're a plumber and you can take fewer jobs that way. But if you're a working mother or a working father and you have childcare responsibilities, it lets you compensate for that. So I have heard, and perhaps this is my difference with Mike Salmon's perspective. I've heard many people who've told me that this would make a difference in their ability to consider running for school committee or for select board, and their reasons are always different. Everyone has different needs that they have in their life. The taking 20 hours a week unpaid out of your life, it leaves a big hole, and money isn't perfect, but it can sometimes fill some of those holes.
And I have a question that I would like, it's a question that I had based on the presentation. Wasn't fully clear to me what the status for, how should I put it? In either of the models that you've discussed, if the elected officials have a stipend, where or how would health insurance become part of that?
So there's a bylaw in bylaw 313 in the town bylaws explicitly seeks to keep the select board out of our health insurance plan.
Yes, I believe I know about that.
Yeah, so the issue, so that wouldn't change, and so in theory they still wouldn't be eligible for health care, but there's been concern raised that the Affordable Care Act would take precedence over that and would cause them to qualify for health care.
I see. Okay.
So if it does, that's still, this is also answers Mike's question, that's still take-home pay, right? So I have the option in my family where my wife and I work, we both have healthcare offered through our job. If I don't deduct it from my paycheck, it gets deducted from her paycheck. If I were a select board member and elected to take healthcare through the town, that's money that's saved elsewhere in my family. So, yes, my take-home pay, the amount that the town gives me in a check might well be less than that top line number, but that's still a benefit to me that gets compensated for in other ways. And the same thing for pension obligations. The Brookline Retirement Board sets credible service, defines what credible service means for elected officials. And so they could elect to define credible service in a way that excludes the select board and school committee. Currently, they haven't made a specific ruling because the pay is less than $5,000 a year, which is sort of the cutoff. There's a blanket, there is no credible service if you're earning less than that amount. But again, that's something which is an opt-in program. If a select board member thought that they could get 10 years credible service working for the town and opted into the pension program, it would get deducted from their paycheck, sure, but that is because they made that choice that was worth it to them. Like I said, different people have different needs. A stipend meets them where they are.
Okay, Mike, you want to add something?
Yes, at the when the advisory committee conducted its hearing on this, the Human Resources Director Ann Braga said that once a stipend exceeds $5,000, it's considered compensation for work and must be included in pension calculations. it's the calculation itself to figure out, well, what is the value of that contribution is not a simple matter, because retirement is a future event. And so she said it would be very difficult to actually come up with a number to, but the main point is that it would be rather surprising, based on what she said, to find that the elected officials would not be eligible for pension.
Okay, so there's some lack of clarity there, I think.
She was quite clear.
Okay, okay, she was clear. There seems to be also, I've got a question, some confusion about how the school committee voted, whether it voted in favor of a stipend, and if it did, wouldn't that represent the same conflict of interest that it would with the select board?
Yeah, they held a public hearing and then elected not to vote a recommendation due to the conflict of interest.
Okay, so the school committee and the select board, all right, neither the school committee nor the select board took a vote on the issue of compensation, which is the text or the content, I guess, of Article 36.
They, yes. Neither of them made a recommendation on the article which included themselves.
Okay, right. So it's
the school committee didn't.
36 and school committee on 37.
Right, and the school committee didn't consider the select board article because they felt that was not within the realm of the schools. The select board, however, did consider the school committee article and voted favorable action by a narrow margin on that.
Okay, and then we do have another question. The questioner asks, has there been any analysis whether or not comparable communities that do provide compensation are seeing greater diversity in these elected positions?
That is an excellent question. And I don't have specific data for you on that. I think partly the trick would be to do a before and after, especially if there was one which adopted it. But that is certainly something I could look into and try to get back, include in my presentation at town meeting.
Okay, thank you. All right, and so there's one more. Is it possible for an elected official, let's just say these were approved, the stipends, could an elected official choose not to take it?
Yes.
All right, so it would be possible for an elected person who was eligible to receive a stipend to choose not to accept it.
Yes, and several school committee and select board members have already announced their intention to do so if it were to pass.
If it were passed, they would not accept it. Okay.
Which in some sense is not terribly surprising. The current members of the members who ran not requiring any sort of compensation, who can afford in some sense to dedicate that amount of time for free, or for effectively free, as the select board case.
Okay. Well, we do not have any more questions, and unless anyone wants to add a comment, I believe we have succeeded in getting through more warrant articles in less time than we did on Monday, and I'm extraordinarily amazed. Very complicated warrant articles they are in addition. So I'm going to say thank you to everyone, to the speakers, to help explain the issues raised in these articles. We hope people have come away with a better understanding of them. I'm very much grateful to the people who have come forward and been willing to join us tonight and present the information. And I hope the information is at least giving people the tools they need, particularly elected town meeting members going to town meeting, and help them in deciding how they're going to vote, because they will in fact be voted, starting with various things on Tuesday of next week. I want just to say finally that the forum was recorded by Big, and it will be available for later viewing. And so you can stay tuned or go to the big website to see when and how the recorded version will be available. And I say at that point, thank you all. Really appreciate it. And good luck at town meeting, whatever happens.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.